I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Today, Friday, January 9th, is a very bad day for Sean Combs. Because Netflix just dropped what 50 Cent is calling the next chapter of The Reckoning. There was no countdown. No flashy trailer pushed for weeks. It just appeared. And when something arrives that quietly, people don't lean back. They lean in. Because silence like that usually means the people involved already know what's coming. This isn't framed as a sequel meant to entertain. It feels like a continuation meant to unsettle. A reminder that the first release wasn't an ending, just a pause. What's important here isn't shock, it's timing. The original series landed when the public was still processing headlines, courtrooms, and speculation. This release lands when attention has slowed, when most people assume the story had settled. That's not accidental. Stories hit hardest when people stop bracing for them. And that's exactly what makes today feel different. 50 Cent isn't presenting this as a takedown. He's presenting it as context. Footage that didn't fit before. Conversations that were never meant to be replayed together. Visuals and timelines that only feel heavy once you see how often the same names, places, and moments overlap. Nothing is shouted, nothing is labeled, and that's what makes viewers uneasy. When something doesn't tell you how to feel, you start feeling it anyway. Before we go deeper, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this story is moving fast, and what happens next won't be announced loudly. What stands out immediately is restraint. This isn't a montage of accusations. It's proximity. Who was around? When they were around? How often the same circles closed in on themselves? Jay-Z's name, for example, isn't framed as a headline. It appears through association, through shared spaces and moments that were always public but never lined up side by side. That's why reactions are split. Some people see nothing new. Others suddenly see patterns they can't unsee. This release doesn't ask for verdicts. It doesn't claim to prove crimes. It does something more uncomfortable. It removes distance. It challenges the idea that time alone resolved anything. And when viewers realize this isn't about one person, but about how silence protected entire ecosystems, the tension shifts. Because once silence stops feeling neutral, every old moment starts to feel heavier. And once that happens, the story doesn't need to escalate. It just needs to exist. That's why today matters. Not because everything changed overnight, but because whatever was unfinished just stepped back into the room. What makes this chapter feel heavier isn't that it claims to reveal something explosive, it's that it refuses to rush past anything. The pacing slows on purpose. Moments are allowed to sit. Clips aren't cut for drama. They're left just long enough for you to notice what normally gets edited out. The pauses, the glances, the way conversations drift away from clarity right when they get close to it. This isn't a story about one clip changing everything. It's about how nothing ever changed because nothing was ever fully addressed. As the footage unfolds, a pattern starts forming without being announced. The same environments keep appearing, the same social circles, the same moments where questions could have been closed, but weren't. Not denied, not explained, just left open. And open questions don't disappear. They linger, especially when time has passed and the same names keep resurfacing in different contexts, different years, different headlines, yet always connected by proximity rather than explanation. What's unsettling is how familiar it all feels once you see it lined up. None of this is framed as new information. It's framed as remembered information. Things people saw once, shrugged at, and moved on from because the moment didn't feel urgent back then. But urgency isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives late, when distance collapses and everything sits side by side. That's when memory stops being passive and starts becoming analytical. This chapter leans into that discomfort. It doesn't accuse, it observes. It lets repetition do the talking. How often the same faces appear without context? How often silence follows moments that should have led somewhere? How often the industry relied on time to smooth edges instead of clarity to close loops? The power here isn't in revelation, it's in alignment. When separate moments finally touch, they change each other. And once you notice that alignment, it's hard to go back to consuming these stories the old way. You stop asking what happened and start asking why nothing followed. Why explanations were always postponed. Why distance was allowed to become the answer. Silence in this light doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels intentional, not sinister, strategic. That's why reactions are so divided. Some viewers see nothing but familiar footage. Others feel something shift. Because this isn't about proof. It's about pressure. Pressure created when unfinished stories are no longer allowed to stay unfinished simply because time passed. Pressure created when the audience stops rushing and starts watching. And that pressure doesn't need to explode to matter. It just needs to remain. What quietly changes here is how responsibility is framed. Not as guilt, not as innocence, but as presence. Who was always around when moments went unexplained? Who stayed visible when things were comfortable? And who faded when clarity would have required more than a sentence? This chapter doesn't push accusations forward. It pulls context backward. It asks you to look again at moments you were told were finished and notice how little was actually resolved. You start to realize how much of the industry runs on fragments. A clip without the full conversation, a headline without the follow-up, an interview that promises answers later, and later never comes. On their own, each fragment feels harmless. Together, they feel deliberate. Not because someone planned chaos, but because no one felt pressured to complete the story. Completion was never required when reputation could carry the weight. This is where attention shifts from personalities to systems, systems that reward silence more than explanation, systems that understand how quickly outrage burns out, and how reliably time smooths discomfort. The documentary doesn't need to say this out loud. It shows it through repetition. The same deflections, the same half answers, the same calm confidence that nothing needs to be clarified because nothing ever was before. What makes this uncomfortable is how normal it all looks. No panic, no scrambling, just a steady reliance on distance. Distance between events, distance between questions and responses, distance between what the audience saw and what they understood. That distance once felt like maturity. Now it feels like insulation. As viewers, you're not being asked to take sides. You're being asked to notice behavior. Who engages deeply and who stays surface level? Who explains fully and who lets time answer for them? These patterns don't accuse anyone. They reveal priorities, and priorities tell their own story. The longer this plays out, the clearer one thing becomes. Silence wasn't a gap. It was a method, a way to let moments pass without closure, trusting that memory would fade faster than curiosity. But memory didn't fade. It stacked. And stacked moments eventually stop feeling coincidental. This is where the tension grows, not through shock, but through recognition. Recognition that power doesn't always hide facts. It manages interpretation. And once interpretation slips out of control, even familiar footage starts to feel different, heavier, not because it proves something new, but because it refuses to disappear. That's the shift happening now. Not louder, just deeper. By this point, something subtle has already shifted in how the story is being processed. The focus isn't on what was just shown, it's on what it forces you to remember. Old interviews, old moments, old reactions that once felt complete suddenly feel unfinished. Not because new information appeared, but because the same answers keep repeating while the questions quietly change. And when answers don't evolve, they start to feel rehearsed rather than reassuring. What becomes impossible to ignore is how often clarity was almost offered, almost explained, almost addressed, then gently redirected. That pattern shows discipline, not fear, not chaos. Discipline in knowing when not to speak, when to let reputation speak instead, when to trust that familiarity will calm curiosity. That strategy worked for years because people consume moments separately. A clip here, a headline there. No one was encouraged to line them up. This time they are. And when moments are placed side by side, the tone matters more than the words. The pauses, the timing, the way responsibility is acknowledged just enough to appear present, but never enough to create a record. Silence here doesn't feel like restraint anymore. It feels like design. Designed to keep stories open-ended so they never demand a conclusion. Because conclusions create accountability. Open endings create comfort. This is where attention stops moving forward and starts circling back. Not aggressively, calmly, patiently. Viewers aren't waiting for a bombshell now. They're watching behavior. Who engages when the conversation is safe? Who disappears when it isn't? Who explains details and who relies on time to smooth the edges? That quiet observation is far more destabilizing than outrage, because it doesn't burn out, it accumulates. And once accumulation begins, silence stops being neutral. It becomes part of the story itself. At this stage, the story stops feeling like it's moving forward and starts feeling like it's tightening. Not because new names are introduced, but because the same ones keep reappearing in places that were never fully explained. Familiar settings, familiar faces, familiar moments that once felt disconnected now sit uncomfortably close together. And when proximity replaces distance, interpretation changes. What stands out is how often opportunity for clarity existed. Moments where a fuller explanation would have ended speculation. Moments where context could have settled everything. Instead, those moments passed quietly, replaced by movement. A new project, a new headline, a new distraction. Movement became the substitute for resolution. And for a long time, that worked. People assumed progress meant closure. It didn't. This chapter leans into that realization without dramatizing it. It lets you sit with how many times stories were redirected rather than resolved. How often conversations ended not with answers, but with transitions. A change of subject, a shift in tone, a reliance on legacy to fill the gaps. Legacy is powerful that way. It doesn't argue. It reassures. And reassurance can be enough when people aren't looking closely. But looking closely is exactly what's happening now. Viewers aren't asking for instant conclusions. They're tracking consistency. Does the response today align with the response years ago? Does the tone change when the question changes? Does silence appear at the same pressure points every time? These aren't accusations. They're measurements. And measurement removes ambiguity. What makes this uncomfortable is that nothing here feels accidental. Not sinister, intentional. Intentional pacing, intentional distance, intentional reliance on time as a buffer. Silence isn't used to hide everything. It's used to avoid explaining the parts that matter most. And when that pattern becomes visible, it doesn't need confirmation to feel real. It explains itself through repetition. This is the point where the audience stops waiting for answers and starts evaluating absence. Absence of explanation, absence of follow-up, absence of closure, and absence when repeated becomes presence. It becomes a signal that something was never meant to be finished publicly. That unfinished feeling doesn't demand outrage. It demands attention. And attention, once it settles in like this, doesn't leave easily. By now, the tension isn't coming from what's being shown. It's coming from what's being withheld. Not withheld as secrecy, but withheld as explanation. The footage exists. The moments are real. The timelines are visible. What's missing is the connective tissue that would turn fragments into a finished story. And the absence of that connection starts to feel louder than any reveal ever could. This is where the audience's role quietly changes. Viewers stop consuming and start comparing. They remember how certain questions were answered years ago and how similar questions are handled now. The language sounds familiar. The calm tone, the emphasis on moving forward, the refusal to slow down long enough to unpack anything fully. That consistency is telling. Not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it reveals habit. Habit is powerful. It doesn't react. It repeats. And repetition creates comfort for the people inside the system, not for the people watching it from the outside. From the outside, repetition begins to look like avoidance. Not avoidance out of fear, but avoidance out of confidence. Confidence that nothing needs to be clarified because nothing ever was before. What's unsettling is how effective that confidence has been. Not because audiences were fooled, but because they were trained. Trained to accept silence as professionalism. Trained to see distance as dignity. Trained to believe that if something truly mattered, someone else would have addressed it already. That assumption carried a lot of weight for a long time. But assumptions don't hold up under sustained attention. And sustained attention is what this moment creates. Not outrage-driven, not impatient, methodical. Viewers aren't demanding explanations anymore. They're noting the lack of them. They're observing how often clarity is postponed, how frequently time is allowed to stand in for truth. And once that observation sets in, silence stops working the way it used to. Because silence depends on forgetting. And forgetting isn't happening here. This is where the pressure becomes quiet but constant. No accusations shouted, no conclusions forced, just a steady awareness that certain stories were never meant to be completed publicly. And once that awareness exists, every future pause carries meaning. Every non-response feels intentional. Every gap becomes part of the narrative. The story doesn't need to escalate now. It's already anchored. At this stage, something subtle but important has already shifted. The story is no longer about whether new footage exists or how shocking it might be. It's about behavior, about how people move when attention stops being temporary and starts becoming sustained. Because power isn't tested when eyes glance at it once. It's tested when those eyes don't look away. What stands out now is how carefully everything is paced. Not rushed, not denied, just measured. Statements that acknowledge without explaining, appearances that reassure without clarifying, a presence that feels controlled, almost rehearsed. That kind of discipline doesn't come from chaos. It comes from experience, from knowing that the safest move has always been to let time do the work. But time isn't working the same way anymore. The audience isn't reacting in bursts. They're settling in. They're rewatching. They're placing old moments next to new ones and noticing how often the same instincts appear. The same pauses, the same deflections, the same comfort with leaving things unresolved. And when repetition becomes visible, it stops feeling accidental. This is where the tension deepens, not explodes, because nothing dramatic has happened on screen. No moment that forces a verdict, no statement that closes the book. Just a growing awareness that closure was never the goal. Control was. Control over pacing, control over focus, control over when a story is allowed to feel over. What's uncomfortable is realizing how normal that once felt, how silence was interpreted as strength, how distance was read as maturity, how unfinished stories were accepted as complete simply because enough time had passed. That logic only works when people move on. They didn't. Now every quiet moment adds weight instead of removing it. Every delay feels logged. Every absence feels noted. Not emotionally, mentally. And mental tracking is dangerous for systems built on patience, outlasting curiosity. Because curiosity didn't burn out this time. It stabilized. This is the point where the story no longer needs new information to stay alive. It feeds on consistency, on watching the same strategies reappear, on noticing how often explanation is available but not chosen. That choice becomes the message. And once people recognize that, the silence stops protecting anything. It starts defining it. From here on, nothing has to be said for the story to continue moving. The audience already knows how to listen. By now, the story has moved past curiosity and into recognition. Not recognition of guilt, recognition of structure, of how moments were handled, delayed, softened, and spaced apart so they never collided. Because once moments collide, patterns form. And patterns don't argue. They don't exaggerate. They just sit there and wait to be noticed. What makes this phase different is that nothing new has to happen for the pressure to grow. The archive already exists. Old interviews, old appearances, old reactions that once felt complete now feel partial. Not wrong, just unfinished. And unfinished things carry weight when people stop rushing past them. This is where silence changes meaning. It no longer reads as discipline or restraint. It reads as a choice, a repeated one. And repetition is what turns behavior into a signal. When the same response appears again and again under different circumstances, it stops being coincidence. It becomes habit. And habit reveals design. The audience isn't asking louder questions. They're asking steadier ones. Questions that don't demand immediate answers. Questions that simply remain unanswered. And unanswered questions don't fade when attention is patient. They mature. They deepen. They turn into quiet reference points that follow every new moment. This is why timing matters more than statements now. When responses arrive quickly for some topics and slowly for others, people notice. When clarity appears where it's convenient and disappears where it would require context, people notice, not emotionally, systematically. What's unsettling is how calm everything remains. No panic, no urgency, just the same measured distance that worked before. But distance only works when people stop measuring it, and they aren't stopping. The story isn't escalating, it's settling. And settled stories don't disappear. They become background pressure, the kind that doesn't scream but doesn't leave either. The kind that changes how every future move is interpreted. Because now every silence adds information. Every pause becomes part of the record. Every non-response communicates just as clearly as a statement would have. And that's the shift. Silence is no longer empty space. It's content. At this stage, the power dynamic quietly flips. The narrative no longer controls the audience. The audience controls the memory. And memory doesn't reset just because nothing happened today. It waits. At this point, the question isn't what will be revealed next. The question is what happens when nothing is revealed at all. Because silence, when it stretches this long, stops feeling neutral and starts feeling deliberate. And deliberate silence changes how every past moment is understood. People are no longer watching for shock. They're watching for consistency. They're comparing reactions across time. Not what was said, but when it was said. Not who spoke, but who didn't. And when you line those moments up, something subtle becomes clear. The same pauses appear at the same pressure points every time. That's not drama. That's pattern. What makes this uncomfortable isn't accusation. It's alignment. Old interviews suddenly sound cautious in the same places. Old answers feel rehearsed around the same topics. Old moments that once felt harmless now feel strategically incomplete. Not wrong, incomplete. And incompleteness is powerful because it lets people assume the rest was handled privately. It lets stories fade without closure. It lets time replace explanation. But time stopped doing that job. The audience changed. They don't forget the way they used to. Clips don't disappear. Context doesn't get buried. Everything sits side by side now, instead of being spread out across decades. And when things sit side by side, gaps show up. Those gaps don't accuse anyone of anything. They accuse the process. They point to how attention was managed, how questions were redirected, how clarity was delayed until it no longer felt necessary. That's why this moment feels heavy without being loud. Nothing new needs to be added. The weight comes from accumulation, from realizing how often the same strategy worked and how rarely it was questioned. Silence used to be interpreted as control. Now it's interpreted as calculation. And calculation invites scrutiny, not outrage. Scrutiny doesn't burn out. It stays. Every future appearance will be filtered through this awareness. Every statement measured against what wasn't said before. Every pause compared to earlier pauses. And once that comparison starts, it doesn't stop. This isn't about endings. It's about permanence. Once people notice how the story was handled, they can't unsee it. The narrative doesn't collapse. It freezes into place. And frozen narratives don't go away. They wait. On Tuesday, December 2nd, Netflix released a documentary that didn't feel like entertainment at all. Sean Combs. The reckoning arrived quietly, without flashy promotion. But within hours, it was everywhere. 4 parts, 1 name, and a feeling that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Viewers didn't watch this series casually. They leaned forward. Because from the opening minutes, it was obvious. This wasn't about nostalgia, music, or legacy. This was about exposure. The documentary didn't rush. It didn't shout. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it understood the gravity of what it was carrying. Old footage appeared first, moments that once felt ordinary, even harmless. But now, placed into context, every expression carried weight. Each pause felt like a warning. Silence didn't cushion, it cut. And somewhere behind that structure was 50 Cent, not on screen pointing fingers, not ranting in interviews, but visible in the blueprint, the pacing, the restraint, the order of revelation. This wasn't case. This wasn't opportunism. It felt strategic, almost surgical. Each piece of material placed exactly where it would collapse denial, where timelines would align without anyone needing to connect the dots out loud. Then the footage escalated, not recycled clips, not speculation. Unreleased videos surfaced, time-stamped, contextualized, aligned with locations and events previously dismissed or forgotten. Viewers watched familiar rooms suddenly feel unfamiliar. Hotel hallways, private lounges, low-light parties. What once seemed glamorous now looked unsettling, not because of what was seen, but because of what suddenly felt undeniable. And after the footage came the call recordings. No background music, no commentary, just real voices speaking casually, confidently, without fear. The tone wasn't defensive. It was assured, the sound of someone convinced consequences don't apply. When the calls ended, the silence that followed hit harder than any allegation. Because arrogance like that only exists when systems look the other way. Across social media, reactions intensified within hours. Clips slowed, audio isolated, dates magnified and frozen. Legal experts rewound segments over and over, matching them to public records and past filings. Journalists reopened archives. Victims' attorneys issued statements. Even people who had never followed the case felt a shift, the feeling that something hidden for decades had finally surfaced. Before going deeper into this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you'll never miss breaking developments like this. Because what happened next in this hypothetical timeline changed everything. Requests poured into prosecutors' inboxes. Motions were drafted. Pressure mounted quietly but forcefully. The original 50-month sentence no longer looked proportional. Conversations moved from public outrage to procedural urgency. By Friday, December 19th, an emergency hearing had been ordered. Cameras banned, access restricted, no media allowed inside. Only the closed courtroom walls would witness what was about to unfold. Diddy entered surrounded by lawyers who walked differently this time, not confident, but guarded. Prosecutors carried folders thicker than before, pages marked with newly surfaced exhibits referenced implicitly in the reckoning. The judge sat expressionless, reviewing the documents before him. In this alternate unfolding, the courtroom felt tense, electric, with unspoken possibility. When the judge spoke, he didn't raise his voice. His words landed softly, but their meaning struck like a hammer. He ruled that the original sentence no longer reflected the severity suggested by the newly examined material, that the weight of accumulated evidence demanded escalation. And in that silent room with no cameras, no audience, no escape, the sentence changed. Life, not metaphorically, not dramatically, a judicial recalibration triggered not by outrage, but by alignment, footage, testimony, timelines converging in full view for the first time. Outside, no one yet knew. Inside, the reckoning had reached its end. And once a system crosses that line, there is no returning to comfort, denial, or control. The narrative didn't just shift, it collapsed, replaced by consequence. The shock inside that courtroom didn't erupt. It settled, heavy and suffocating. The moment the judge's final words faded, something shifted that couldn't be undone. Not a sound came from the defense table. No objection, no argument, just stunned silence. The kind of silence that comes only when people realize the system has moved past negotiation. Diddy stared forward, eyes fixed, expression unreadable. For years, cameras followed him everywhere. But here, in this sealed room, there were no lenses, no press flashes, no curated image to protect. Just walls, witnesses, and consequence. The air felt colder, as if the temperature dropped with the verdict. Some said later it felt like time slowed the second that word. Life was spoken. Outside, the city breathed unaware. Court officers carried on routine tasks, not realizing history had already shifted inside the locked chamber. Only a few federal staff knew what had taken place, and even they struggled to process the weight of it. Because this wasn't sentencing, it felt like closure slamming shut. As the judge finalized paperwork, lawyers exchanged glances that said more than words could. Their faces carried something between disbelief and inevitability. They had prepared arguments for months, But no one had prepared for a reversal like this. A sentence multiplied into permanence. The room remained frozen even after the judge stood to leave. It was only when the bailiff stepped forward that movement returned. Diddy stood slowly, not defiant, not collapsing, just hollow. A man finally realizing no amount of influence could reopen the door that had just closed. Security escorted him toward the side exit, not the main hallway. A short walk, but each step sounded heavier. One attorney whispered something, but Diddy didn't respond. He didn't look back. Maybe he couldn't. The double steel door shut behind them, and that metallic echo felt final. Word didn't leak immediately. It traveled quietly at first. A hushed phone call to a clerk's supervisor, a late email marked urgent, a sealed transmission sent through official channels. People far removed from the courtroom felt their stomachs drop when they read the message. A lifetime sentence, administrative classification, high security transfer pending. Suddenly, the world outside seemed too loud, too fast, unaware of what had just taken shape beneath the surface. For decades, power had insulated Sean Combs. But power can delay consequence, never erase it. Inside federal buildings, lights stayed on late into the night as teams prepared documents, alerts, and transfer protocols. No press release, no statement, just the machinery of justice beginning to move uncompromised for the first time in this case. Meanwhile, former associates received unexpected contacts from legal offices. Some froze when they answered, knowing instinctively what the call meant. Statements they once stayed silent about now demanded clarification. Timelines they thought faded resurfaced. And while the world waited unknowingly for the breaking news, something deeper unfolded in the quiet corners of the legal system. Files flagged as low priority were reopened. Digital evidence previously considered outside scope was re-examined, not to question guilt, but to prepare for the next phase. Because a sentence like that forces review of everything surrounding it. In this alternate chain of events, the documentary hadn't just revealed footage, it had illuminated patterns. The judge hadn't reacted to outrage, he responded to alignment. And when alignment forms across testimony, footage, timelines, and reaction, the system must shift. But the public still had no idea. Not yet. Screens were dark, notifications silent, headlines waiting to be written. Somewhere inside a small federal briefing room, a media liaison drafted the language that would eventually inform the world. Every word debated, every comma considered. Because announcements like this reshape narratives people once assumed permanent. And while the clock moved toward morning, Diddy remained in holding. No cameras, no luxury, no entourage. A quiet cell, fluorescent light humming, guards stationed nearby. A man accustomed to control, now held by a system finally outside his influence. The night felt endless for everyone aware of what had happened. Some paced hallways, others sat stunned, staring at screens with messages they weren't allowed to send. And somewhere in that silence, the truth settled. The reckoning hadn't ended with the documentary. It had only begun. The next morning arrived like any other winter morning in the city. Cold sidewalks, steam rising from street grates, commuters rushing past each other without eye contact. But inside one federal building, a different kind of morning unfolded. Staff entered quietly, badges swiped without greeting. No one spoke of what happened, but everyone felt it. People avoided meeting each other's eyes, as if acknowledging the truth might give it weight too quickly. Phone lines remained locked down. Internal memos warned staff to avoid discussing proceedings even off record. The hallways felt like a sealed container holding pressure no one dared release. A few assistants exchanged glances, heavy with unspoken realization something irreversible had begun, and the institutions tasked with managing it were still bracing for impact. Behind reinforced doors, lawyers reviewed logistics for transfer and appeal. Pages turned slowly, hands trembling just slightly, not out of fear, but because the scale of what lay ahead had finally come into focus. A lifetime sentence wasn't an end. It triggered procedures, audits, internal reviews stretching back years. Files once archived for closure were being pulled again. Hard drives accessed. Authentication procedures initiated. The machine was awake now, and it was festivist. Meanwhile, far from the quiet government offices, Production crews at major networks prepared for what they sensed was coming. Anonymous sources hinted that a major development was imminent, and news directors demanded round-the-clock readiness. Editors bookmarked clips from the documentary. Analysts rehearsed legal terminology, careful to hedge every sentence. But before the news would break, another ripple began among the people closest to the story. Former employees started texting each other fragments. "Did you hear? It finally happened?" They reopened everything. Word spread through encrypted chats across time zones. Some messages carried relief, others fear. A few simply said, "I knew this day would come." In the music world, executives received private courtesy calls warning them to prepare for statements. Meetings were postponed, contracts reviewed, footage scrubbed. Lawyers drafted updated talking points before breakfast. Entire PR strategies shifted in a matter of hours, panic concealed behind corporate composure. For fans who grew up on Combs' music, there was a different emotional fracture forming. Social media group chats filled with disbelief and uneasy silence. Memories of radio hits and champagne-drenched music videos clashed violently with what viewers saw in The Reckoning. Nostalgia collided with consequence, and people began asking themselves questions they'd avoided for years. Inside one quiet apartment, a woman who once worked in Combs' inner circle watched the documentary replayed on her television. Her face was expressionless, but her hands trembled slightly as she recognized locations and conversations she'd quietly tried to forget. She muted the audio, closed her eyes, and whispered almost to herself, "It wasn't supposed to go this far." Yet deep down, she knew it always would. Hours later, as federal transportation officers prepared final custody transfer documents, a single notification appeared on the secure court terminal. The press would be briefed within the hour. Outside, news vans surged toward the courthouse steps. Microphones extended across barriers. Anchors rehearsed opening lines they had prayed and feared they'd one day deliver. And as the world prepared to hear what had happened behind closed doors, a chill moved through the corridors of power because everyone understood one truth now. Once the first public word left the courthouse steps, the narrative would shift permanently. Not a rumor, not speculation. A reckoning made real, rippling outward toward a public unprepared for what came next. Outside the courthouse, the crowd didn't know what they were waiting for, only that something had shifted. Reporters huddled behind barricades, breath visible in the winter air, eyes fixed on the sealed doors as if they might tremble open. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance, but here, time seemed suspended. Inside, staff prepared press packets, hands moving quickly, quietly. No one needed to be told to stay focused. The gravity of the moment pressed against every wall. A single printer jam felt like a breakdown in the chain of control, and someone cleared the air with trembling urgency. This was not a morning for mistakes. The spokesperson read the briefing statement one last time. Redacted
we
names,
have to find somebody
verbs,
that'll work with us that
controlled
has
language.
dealt in the dirtiest
Every
of
word
dirty
chosen
business.
not just for
We're
clarity,
losing.
but for precision, language calibrated to withstand the weight of history. A deep breath, and then the doors opened. Microphones rose in unison. Camera shutters clicked like distant applause. But when the spokesperson spoke, no one interrupted. Voices lowered to silence. Every syllable carried impact. A sentence revised, custody transferred, appeals prepared. And beneath the official phrasing, every listener felt the same realization, that accountability, delayed for decades, had finally taken a form no one believed possible. The feed hit newsrooms instantly. Lower third captions flashed across screens. Phones buzzed. People froze mid-task. In living rooms, bars, offices, the announcement spread like a fault line cracking beneath the country. Reactions erupted online with breathtaking speed. Some expressed rage. How had it taken so long? Others clung to disbelief. A few typed that they always suspected something darker beneath the glossy image of wealth and power. And thousands simply watched, unable to look away from the unraveling of a legacy they once celebrated. But beneath public reaction, quieter ripples traveled through legal networks. Prosecutors exchanged messages that hinted at next
We
steps.
have to find somebody
Civil
that'll work
attorneys
with us
filed
that has dealt
timestamped
in
motions
the
within
dirtiest
minutes.
of dirty business.
Alert to doors
We're
now
losing.
open. Investigators reviewed dormant leads with renewed urgency. A machine long stalled by lack of momentum suddenly accelerated. Meanwhile, people once connected to Combs sat alone, some in gated mansions, others in modest apartments. They stared at the news, haunted by memories they'd spent years burying. A former bodyguard paced his living room, replaying moments he had justified as loyalty. A studio engineer scrolled through old texts, fingers hovering over delete. One assistant whispered a prayer, then picked up her phone to call a lawyer. Foundations of silence cracked privately before they broke publicly. In the entertainment world, executives whispered behind closed boardroom doors. Projects paused, contracts suspended. Streaming platforms issued internal notices to reevaluate licensing agreements. Publicists rehearsed statements miles away from cameras. No one wanted to be the first to speak, and no one wanted to be the last. Through it all, one question surfaced everywhere at once. If this sentence was now final, what had been missed before? What had stayed hidden? The documentary had raised eyebrows. This ruling raised alarms. And as speculation grew, the media cycle began feeding on itself, exposing connections, timelines, and unexplored relationships. Somewhere in the middle of the frenzy, a quiet realization settled like dust. The sentencing was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would reach far beyond one courtroom, one man, or one documentary. The world had waited years for clarity. It arrived not loudly, but unmistakably. And now, as the system moved forward, the consequences of that movement would reshape lives, industries, and history, one revelation at a time. In studios across the country, anchors struggled to maintain composure as live broadcasts shifted from entertainment coverage to breaking national news. Producers frantically signaled behind cameras, stacking papers, updating teleprompters line by line. When familiar faces in newsrooms paused before reading the developing story, audiences felt a chill. Something unprecedented was unfolding. Phones began ringing in law offices before reporters finished their sentences. Some rang unanswered. Others were answered with trembling breaths and clipped responses. "We're reviewing. No comment at this time. We were not notified." Each reply confirmed what the public sensed instinctively. This wasn't just a dramatic twist. It was a rupture. In living rooms, families watched silently, their televisions casting pale light across stunned faces. Older viewers who remembered the height of Combs' success shook their heads in disbelief. Younger viewers, raised on curated celebrity perfection, stared wide-eyed at the collapse of a narrative they'd been taught was untouchable. Digital timelines filled with disbelief. How did it get here? What else didn't we know? Who protected him this long? Meanwhile, inside secure government servers, archived files were tagged for escalation. Access protocols updated, trace logs reactivated. What had once taken years to compile was now accelerating. And as digital queues filled, analysts leaned closer to their screens, their faces illuminated not by curiosity, but by obligation. The conversation shifted from shock to examination. The tone became clinical. It was no longer about celebrity, it was about systems, failures, power structures, and the invisible architecture that shields influence. Experts pointed out quiet red flags that had gone unnoticed for years. Sealed settlements, NDAS, disappearing footage, abrupt employment terminations, sealed court filings. Threads once considered unrelated now appeared interconnected. A former employee watched the news alone, hands pressed against his mouth. He replayed moments he'd dismissed years earlier as industry normal, now understanding why he never fully slept easy afterward. The soundtrack of luxury and nightlife faded in his memory, replaced by the uneasy feeling he'd buried. As headlines scrolled, he whispered to himself, "It won't stop here." Across the music industry, executives held emergency calls, voices tense and low. Emails flew marked confidential. Legal departments reviewed contracts dated decades back. Even those who had never met Combs felt the tremor ripple through boardrooms. Because when the foundation beneath one empire cracks, fears rise that more structures might collapse. In Los Angeles, a PR strategist stared at her phone, scrolling through messages from panicked clients demanding reassurance. She knew reassurance would be impossible. Once a life sentence entered public consciousness, it cast a shadow longer than scandal. It threatened legacies. She opened a blank statement draft, but hesitated. There were no words neutral enough to withstand what was coming. Back in New York, journalists revisited timelines, asking questions that had always hovered at the edges, but were too dangerous to articulate publicly before this moment. Now, hesitation dissolved. Whispers became investigations. Patterns took shape in plain sight. The public's curiosity sharpened into scrutiny. Every name associated with the empire felt exposed. Even silence became suspicious. Former allies slowly distanced themselves. Social media unfollows, statement scrubs, archived interviews. One by one, relationships dissolved quietly, as if severing ties could outrun implication. But beneath the panic, something more profound took hold. A collective reflection emerged, not about a single man, but about the cultural machinery that elevated him. How charisma concealed control, how power masked manipulation, how fame insulated consequence, and why it took a documentary, not pain, not testimony, for the world to finally pay attention. The reckoning had crossed beyond one courtroom and one life. It now moved through institutions, memories, loyalties, and histories. In this unfolding timeline, the sentence wasn't the climax, it was the trigger, a signal that the unseen scaffolding protecting powerful figures could be dismantled, not through spectacle, but through exposure. And as night fell across the country, screens glowed with endless analysis, speculation, shock. But beneath the noise, a quieter realization settled in. This wasn't only a fall from grace. It was the collapse of an illusion that had lasted decades, now dissolving in real time. As the night deepened, the country seemed to exhale in disbelief. News cycles continued without pause, but somewhere beneath the headlines, a quieter current started to form. Questions whispered not by sensationalists, but by people sitting alone, replaying memories and reevaluating moments they once ignored. Inside a luxury penthouse overlooking Manhattan, a former executive poured a drink he wouldn't touch. His hands shook, not from guilt alone, but from the realization that proximity to power had blinded him for years. He justified closed-door meetings, late-night calls, trips arranged with odd instructions. He told himself it wasn't his place to ask questions. Now, the silence he once believed protected his career felt like complicity. Across town, a woman scrolled through years of messages, stopping at one conversation she had buried in her mind. A sudden invitation, a change in plans, a night she declined instinctively, without understanding why she felt unsafe. As she stared at the thread, her breath caught. It wasn't paranoia back then. It was instinct, an instinct ignored by too many for too long. In a dimly lit studio, a veteran producer replayed footage from decades ago. Not music videos, behind-the-scenes clips stored in dusty hard drives. Faces flashed past the screen, assistants running errands at odd hours, young artists avoiding eye contact, security staff stationed outside locked rooms. He paused the footage, studying a detail he never questioned during production. A chill ran down his spine. It was always there, hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, in a federal transport vehicle moving through quiet streets, Diddy sat motionless, staring ahead. He had spent a lifetime controlling narratives, rewriting stories, shaping perceptions. But now, surrounded by steel and guards, the power he once wielded felt distant, irrelevant. His mind replayed decisions made long before this moment, moments once dismissed as harmless, excusable, or untouchable. Now, each memory pressed against him like a weight he could no longer shift onto someone else. In suburban homes, parents muted televisions as their children entered the room, unsure how to explain the fall of a man once celebrated. Teenagers scrolled through headlines on their phones, struggling to reconcile music they admired with allegations too overwhelming to ignore. Some deleted playlists quietly without comment. Others posted cryptic messages hinting at betrayal. Beyond individual reactions, institutions moved with mechanical precision. Universities reviewed honorary awards. Foundations reconsidered past donations. Boards convened emergency sessions to assess risk exposure. The ripple effects stretched far beyond entertainment. Corporate lawyers drafted protocols to handle historical misconduct, reviews triggered by public pressure. Fear of precedent loomed, but responsibility pressed harder. And somewhere in the middle of the chaos, one quiet
We
truth
have to find
emerged.
somebody that'll
People
work
who
with
had
us
been
that has
dismissed
dealt
for
in the
years, whose
dirtiest of dirty
testimonies were
business.
minimized,
We're losing.
mocked, or silenced, now felt something unfamiliar. Validation. Not closure, but the beginning of acknowledgement. Screenshots surfaced of private group chats where survivors typed messages through tears. They finally listened. It matters now. In press rooms, journalists sensed the shift too. The tone of reporting changed from speculative to solemn. Commentators paused before offering opinions, aware this wasn't just scandal, it was systemic exposure. A mirror held up to an industry built on access, power, and silence. Across social platforms, a single question echoed. If this could happen to a figure this powerful, who else might be exposed? The question spread not as threat, but as reckoning. People wondered how many stories had been buried under NDAS, settlements, encrypted drives, and loyalty purchased through fear. The world didn't need court transcripts to feel the magnitude of what had happened. They felt it in their chests, in the sudden distance between nostalgia and reality, in the sharp fracture between celebrity worship and accountability. By midnight, the streets were nearly empty, but screens still glowed behind apartment curtains. People remained awake scrolling, refreshing, connecting dots they'd never dared connect before. It wasn't outrage driving them now, it was recognition. Recognition that secrets don't stay hidden forever. That power doesn't erase consequence, it delays it. And in this alternate unfolding of events, that delay had finally ended. For hours, the world watched the fallout spread like shockwaves. But the true turning point wasn't the sentence itself. It was what happened next. Quietly, unexpectedly, in a windowless room just beyond the courthouse basement. When officials prepared Diddy for transfer, protocol required a final review of personal property collected during booking. Bags sealed, inventory logged, nothing unusual. But as officers cross-checked items with intake records, one officer paused. Inside a worn leather folder was a phone, powered off, encrypted, legally surrendered. Nothing remarkable at first glance, except it wasn't on the original list. Chain of custody demanded review. Supervisors gathered. A digital forensics expert was called. Procedures had to be followed, not because anyone anticipated significance, but because every deviation in a high-profile case required scrutiny. When the phone powered on in isolation mode, the screen flickered. Then notifications flooded the display in a rapid cascade, like a timeline unraveling in seconds. Unread messages, voice memos, encrypted photo backups automatically queued for cloud sync. The forensics team exchanged uneasy looks. They paused, then opened the first file. Inside were voice recordings, not polished productions, not outgoing commands, private exchanges, casual in tone, chilling in implication. Conversations referencing people, dates, payments, mentions of arrangements, and reassurances given when inconvenient questions were raised. The casual familiarity in the voices suggested long-standing expectation of silence. The next folder contained timestamps matching locations from the documentary. Not identical footage, but parallel moments, angles no one outside a closed circle should have seen. And suddenly, the narrative shifted again. The documentary wasn't the end of exposure, it was only the surface. A supervisor called upstairs. Within minutes, doors slammed, radios crackled, and the transfer order stalled. Judges were notified. Federal counsel assembled urgently, expressions hardened by something that resembled fear. Because if even a fraction of what was on that device aligned with public allegations, the implications stretched far beyond sentencing. Outside, the press remained unaware. Anchors speculated about the next steps. Analysts debated appeals, experts discussed precedent. None realized the story behind the sealed basement doors had taken a turn so sharp it threatened to reshape the entire legal landscape around the case. Inside the holding corridor, Diddy noticed the delay. For the first time since the sentencing, emotion flickered across his face. Not despair, but recognition. He understood something had been discovered. Something he thought unreachable. Something he never intended anyone to access. An assistant U.S. attorney arrived, breathless, coat still flung from rushing. She reviewed a sample of the files, her expression shifting from disbelief to calculation. She whispered a sentence no one expected. "We need to escalate. Immediately." In a matter of moments, the scope of the case expanded beyond sentencing, beyond one man. Lawyers spoke in hushed urgency, referencing possible conspiracy implications, obstruction risks, patterns suggesting coordination. Words once theoretical became procedural: subpoena, grand jury, network exposure. This was the turning point. Not when the judge revised the sentence, not when headlines broke. The turning point arrived when evidence surfaced that suggested the truth ran deeper than anyone imagined. Threads connecting powerful names, institutions, favors exchanged in shadows. The room thickened with a realization. The life sentence wasn't the conclusion. It was the door to a new level of consequence, one that had never been intended to see the light. For the first time, officials sensed the magnitude of what lay ahead. The reckoning that began in a documentary now threatened to pull others into its gravity. A prosecutor closed the device carefully, hands trembling slightly. She whispered to a colleague, "This isn't over. Not even close." And in that moment, a new silence settled. Not the silence of shock, but the silence before a storm, before systems shift again, before the world learns there are depths to this story still unexplored. A silence heavy enough to signal that the most explosive revelations were still ahead.